Well, I'm thankful today not to be on crutches. It definitely makes life a little bit more easy. And we'll see how long I can stand. If I need to, I get tired, I'm going to have to sit today. But we are in the story of Ruth, in the book of Ruth. And we left her proposing to Boaz at night, asking him if he would marry her. And he said, I will, but there's a possible glitch. There is a relative who is closer than I am. And he's got first rights to buy the family property, and you come with it as the wife. So I'm going to take care of that. I'll settle that in the morning. And so Ruth goes back home to Naomi, and Naomi gives her the counsel in chapter 3 and verse 18. Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And so what we find in chapter 4 is Boaz's action to redeem Ruth. And the first thing that he does is there is a legal matter that needs to be settled. So chapter 4 and verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. So the gate of the city, that's where they did all the official business. This was the place that legal matters were decided. The business transactions were settled. It was kind of like our courthouse, our county courthouse, or our town hall. So once you passed through the gates of the city, there was this little tunnel, and on each side of the tunnel there were 2 rooms, and each of these rooms had a bench in it, and you could have enough people, maybe, 10, 15 people, and so that's where this first scene is taking place, inside that room, just right outside the gates of the city. So Boaz, he arrives first thing in the morning, and he sits down and he waits, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. So this man was closer relative than Boaz was to Elimelech, Naomi's husband that was dead. And so Boaz spots him. He's probably on his way out through the gates of the city to go out to the field to go to work. And Boaz calls him friend. It's interesting that his name is not mentioned. That's an emphasis of why he's not mentioned. The word friend there is really a nice way to talk to this guy. We could say, Mr. So-and-so. So sit down here. I've got some business to settle with you. So Boaz then appoints 10 in verse 2, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. So apparently in those times that they didn't write a lot of legal documents down and archive them like we do today. They would have witnesses. So to have a quorum, a necessary number to settle business, Boaz, he picks out 10 of the men who are in the area, elders. And so if it ever came up a question of, did this transaction really happen? Then one of them would be a witness. Yes, I was there, I saw what happened. So Boaz is going through all the proper legal proceedings to make this a done deal. So he explains in verse 3 to the Redeemer about Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, as if he doesn't know, he didn't hear the news, which I'm sure he did, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is none besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So without a husband to take care of her anymore, without her sons to take care of her, she was in desperate times. And so she wants to sell the family land. She wants to keep it within the clan. And doing that, whoever buys the land that belongs to her would be responsible then to take care of her as a widow. She's too old to have any more children. We learned that earlier in the story. And so it's probably a slam dunk for this guy, because all he has to do is provide for Naomi. And she's old enough, one of these days she's going to die. And then he gets all of her land as his own. So that's going to be for his children. When he dies, they'll inherit all that new land. So, this is definitely increasing his net worth and the ability to make more money. So he says, I will redeem it at the end of verse 4. So You say, I thought that Boaz was going to talk to this guy about marrying Ruth. He hasn't even mentioned Ruth yet. Wasn't that the whole point of the meeting? of marrying Ruth. I mean, he hasn't said that he wants to marry Ruth. He hasn't even brought up Ruth's name yet. So what's wrong with Boaz? Does he have amnesia? Has he forgotten what he's there for? Has he gotten greedy, like I get all this land? This guy doesn't go through with it? No, he hasn't forgotten. Is he being dishonest? Not bringing this up as they're negotiating? No, he is a shrewd negotiator, and he brings up Ruth at the critical time of the deal. So Boaz says, where are we at? Verse 5. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So we don't know why he can't redeem it. He just says it might impair or might spoil his inheritance. You know, maybe he doesn't think that he has enough means to take care of both Naomi and Ruth like Boaz could. Maybe he is concerned about what happens if Ruth, he's going to be married to Ruth in this arrangement. She obviously can have children. And if she has children, then those children are going to inherit this land. So I'm going to buy this land for what? In the end, I'm going to have to give it to her kids. And it's going to complicate things in my life because I'm going to have to divide all the land up between all of our children, my old kids and my new kids. And I don't want to complicate my life that way. I don't want to deal with that. And maybe it was because he didn't like the idea of marrying a Moabite woman. That was a stigma to him. So whatever reason he gives, he says, I cannot do that, so I give up my right for this deal. So verse 7, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So apparently when they wrote the book of Ruth, that they weren't practicing this custom. And basically the sandal represented the legal transaction of transferring the title deed ownership of the land to the new owner once he made the payment. It was his right now. He took that sandal. It was his right now to walk on that property as if he owned the property for himself. So I'm giving up my right to it. It's yours now. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Those were her two sons that had died. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this day. So when Ruth, the night before, asked Boaz to marry her, she didn't realize how complicated this was. She didn't realize that it was more than just a wedding. It was more than just a marriage. It was also land. It was also responsibility of taking care of widows. It was also inheritance that would come one day to multiple children. She had no idea how complicated this was, but Boaz is patiently proceeding through the legal process. And now he officially says in verse 10, I want to marry Ruth. And the reason that he gives is so interesting. This is the Israeli version. The American version would say, now at this time, Boaz said, I can't live without Ruth. I love her with all my heart. I can't imagine about spending the rest of my life without Ruth by my side. Oh, I just love you so much. Oh, that's the American version. Here's the Israeli version. The reason why I want to marry Ruth, he already said this back in verse 5, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. And now he adds to that that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this day. So the main reason he gives for marrying her is that the name of the dead may not be cut off. Of course, this is not how we think in America. We don't think about our ancestors and responsibility that we have for the legacy that they have left for us. We don't think about that. We think about me and my life and the future. So what he's talking about here is what we call the law of the leveret. And that goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 25, the law of the leveret. That is where you marry the brother of your deceased husband. Now, the brother of your deceased husband wasn't forced to marry you. It wasn't like a shotgun wedding. But there was great shame involved if you didn't do that, if you didn't marry your deceased brother's widow who was childless. And when you married her, you were expected to have children, and the son would be named after your deceased brother so that his name would continue on in Israel. His name would not be cut off. It was unimaginable to them that a family, that a name would be cut off in Israel, cut off from the covenant community of God, cut off from the land inheritance, cut off from the future. And so when that happened, it was like this person is gone. Even though they're gone, it's like they are really gone. They're no longer part of us. And so Boaz says, I don't want that to happen. Now, this is a little bit different than the normal leveret marriage, because obviously Ruth is not, he wasn't related to Ruth in the sense that her deceased husband Mahlon was his brother. But the spirit of this, the grace of this, he's wanting to live that out. For him, this was not a hard decision to make. It wasn't, do I love this woman? No. Now, he did look at her and thought of her as quite a catch, as we looked at in chapter 3. He looked at her and he was impressed by her. He admired her character. He said she is a worthy woman. She is a godly woman who wants to do the right thing, what she did for taking care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. But it doesn't say he loved her. His decision was based on, I want to do the right thing, and the right thing is to raise up the name of this person who has died so that their name continues to live on in Israel. And actually the idea of the word perpetuate means to arise, to arise. So the death has taken them down, but I want them to rise again and be with us again so that they are recognized in Israel. So this is an incredible reason why he wants to get married to Ruth. I think it's hard for us to relate to that, but for him it was clear as day. So they're there in this room, and there's these 10 elders, and there's Mr. So-and-so on one side, and there's Boaz over here, and he's taken off his sandal, and he hands it to Boaz, and Boaz says this, and then all these people, they realize something really extraordinary is taking place. So all these people are kind of looking in on what's transpiring and say, man, this is really cool. In verse 11, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah. That's an old name for Bethlehem. And be renowned in Bethlehem. So they say, we don't want you to be happy. I mean, obviously they did want them to be happy. I mean, why else do people go into marriage if not to be happy and satisfied in their lives? But they see the main purpose of this marriage is not for their happiness. The happiness is more of the byproduct of doing right. But the main purpose, they say, of this marriage is we want you to have children. And we want those children to be just like what happened when Jacob married Leah and Rachel. They had a family. They had actually 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And the 12 tribes of Israel became the nation of Israel just from that one family. God did something extraordinary. And they were saying, this is an amazing story of what's happening right now with Boaz and Ruth. And we want God again to do something really, really big. That happens with the kids that we have. Isn't that interesting? And this brings them to the next part of their wish in verse 12. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So there may be some there who would object to Boaz marrying a Moabite. After all, they were supposed to be our enemies. After all, the law said that a Moabite may not enter into the temple to worship the Lord for 10 generations. Now, I don't know if that qualified with a Moabite who is a believer in the Lord and Jehovah. So there could have been some attitudes there about, I don't know if this is the right for them to do this, for Boaz, this man of high standing in our town, to do this. And so they go back and they give a blessing of what happened with Judah. He was one of the sons of Jacob, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, with Tamar. Do you remember that story? It takes place back in Genesis chapter 38. Tamar was probably a Canaanite woman, so she was a Gentile too, just like Ruth was a Gentile. And she was married to the firstborn of Judah, and her husband passed away. And so the law of the Levirate, all right, the brother is supposed to marry the widow who's childless to raise up in the name of the deceased brother. And so he doesn't provide a child. He selfishly doesn't do that. And so God strikes him down for his selfishness. Well, Judah only has one more son left, and Judah says to Tamar, well, he's too young for you. You have to wait till he's older. So the time comes where he should be given to Tamar in marriage, and she's passed over, and she remains as a childless widow. And she sees that it's not going to happen, that this youngest son is never going to be given to her. And so what she does is something that we don't like to talk about. It's a scandal. But she dresses up as a prostitute, and she goes to the place where she knows that Judah is going to pass by. And he goes in with her, and through that relationship, she conceives and she is pregnant. And then when her pregnancy is known, Judah is outraged, and he says, this woman, I know she's my daughter-in-law, this woman should die for what she did. And she said, well, the man who did this to me is responsible. He owns these things. When Judah did that with Tamar, she said, what will you give me as a promise that you will come back and pay me for this service? And she left, and he left with her some of his items. And so she says, these items belong to the man who did this to me. And Judah realized, those belong to me. I was the one that did this to her. Yes. And he said, she was more righteous than I. I was not willing to give my son to her in marriage and fulfill the law, and she was more righteous than I. So the idea is that God can override bad things. That circumstance that shouldn't have happened, that God can bring good out of that, because out of her pregnancy, she gave birth to twins, and the oldest was named Perez, and through his line came Elimelech and Boaz, a very famous family in Israel. So that was the blessing that they give on Boaz. So Boaz, in verse 10, he says, I want to marry Ruth. He says, I take Ruth the Moabite. I've paid the price to be my wife. He intended to take her as his lawfully wedded wife, and he made his intention known publicly. He was an honorable man. He wasn't going to live together with her to see if it worked out, and if it worked out, well, maybe he would think about getting married to her. No, that would have been unthinkable to him. Before he took her as his wife to come into his home to be with him, he made public through the legal channels that he was going to be legally married. They were going to be husband and wife together before they began normal marital relations. So that's what he makes known. Now, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. We don't know how much time transpired. If he went the next day, that day, today, there's so much planning and preparation that goes involved in a wedding. It wasn't like that back then. No, I've agreed I'm going to marry her. I paid the price. I'm going to go get her as my wife. And so that's what he does. And it says he went into her, they started marital relations, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So probably not long after they came together as husband and wife, God blessed that union with a pregnancy. and then with a baby boy. And we see that the baby came after they were married, not before. They kept themselves pure before God before their wedding. And this baby is going to be seen as such a blessing to them and not a burden. And not only to them, but surprisingly to Naomi as well. We see what this baby is going to mean to Naomi in verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer." This is the only time in the Bible that a baby is called a redeemer. And these women are very God-focused, God-conscious, and they're aware this is God. We know that Ruth was married for 10 years to Mahlon, and she never had a child. And yet, as soon as she comes together with Boaz, the Lord blesses and allows her to have this baby, and they have high hopes for this baby. May his name be renowned in Israel. May everybody, not just in Bethlehem, but in the whole nation, know about this baby. And then notice what they say they want this baby to do for her. Two things. Verse 15, he shall be to you a restorer of life. A restorer of life. It's like they are giving a prophecy here of what the baby is going to do for Naomi. A restorer of her life. We recall Naomi's condition when she left Bethlehem the first time. She was full. She had her husband and she had her 2 sons. And then they died in Moab. And she comes back to town after 10 years and they recognize her. Is this Naomi? And she says, don't call me that anymore. Call me Mara. It means bitter. For the Lord hath dealt bitterly with me. I'm no longer a pleasant person, fun to be with. No, I am a bitter person. You don't want to hang out with me. I am a lost person. And yet this child, what is this child going to do? It's going to restore her life. You know, Naomi did her best to drive her daughter-in-laws away. You remember on the road back to Israel, she said, why are you going with me back to Bethlehem? You need to go back home. You'll never find a husband in Bethlehem. There won't be any Israeli man that will want to marry you. And you wait around for me to have more children. It's not going to happen, and you wouldn't want to wait that long. You just need to go back home. She tried to push her daughters-in-law away. Now look at what God has done. God has given her a grandchild. And this grandchild is going to restore her life to her. Notice the second thing that this child is going to do. This child will be a nourisher of your old age. He will be there to take care of you after Boaz passes off the scene. I take that maybe Boaz and Naomi were about the same age. I think that Boaz was probably old enough to be the father age to Ruth. And so, Boaz is not going to be there forever. And typically, women outlive men. And so who is going to take care of Naomi when that happens, when Boaz is no longer there? Because Boaz had responsibility to take care of Naomi once he bought the property and married Ruth. So she has nothing to worry about, a nourisher of your life. Nothing to worry about. Boaz passes off the scene. I'm not going to lose the land. I'm not going to go hungry because I have this little grandchild. He's going to grow up and he's going to pay back all the services that I'm going to be providing for him. So God has met all of her needs. God has given her hope when she didn't have hope. God has put back together the dream that was shattered. God has restored her life. Now notice what this child is going to do. Well, actually look at what Ruth is going to do for Naomi. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. So Ruth did not have to marry Boaz. Ruth did not have to stay in this family. She could have went after one of the younger men, one of the promising people who are coming up in Bethlehem. She didn't have to stay with this family. She didn't have to marry this guy who maybe was, twice her age or 20 years older than her. She didn't have to do that. But the reason why she was there was because of Naomi. She gave up the right to ever be married again. When she went back to Bethlehem with Naomi, in her mind, I'm never going to get married again. But because I think so much of Naomi and I love her so much and I want to take care of her in her old age, I'm willing to make that sacrifice. And it was obvious to everybody that Ruth loved Naomi. And so they say, this has all happened because this woman has loved you, and she is more, or she is better to you than 7 sons. This was a saying in Israel of having a perfect family. You wanted to have 7 sons. And this woman is better to you than 7 sons. Verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. So Naomi more than likely lived with Boaz and Ruth. She, as a child's grandmother, became like the child's nanny, the child's babysitter, the one who is constantly with the child, the one who is constantly caring for the child. Her life now had taken a major turn for good. She no longer had time to feel sorry for herself, to live in her past and what happened with the losses. Now she had something of why she got up in the morning, something to live for, somebody else to live for besides herself, this little grandchild. And notice the blessing that the women talk about. This is unusual, they gave him a name saying, a son has been born to Naomi. To Naomi. So I thought that was Ruth. Well, yeah, but it's for Naomi too. And they named him Obed. Obed. Do you know anybody by the name of Obed? Do you know what that Hebrew name means? It means servant, a worker. He's going to be a blessing. He's going to repay all the service that you provided to him as a baby growing up. He's going to repay that. He's going to be your servant. He's going to be your worker. He is going to care for your needs. He's going to be your redeemer. But what does this child mean for Israel? Here's a surprise to the story. He, Obed, was the father of Jesse, the father of David. We're talking about King David here. King David. Ruth becomes the grandmother of David, the great-grandmother, I should say, of King David. Both Boaz and Ruth and Obed are all in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1. So this story ends with a genealogy, and kind of the genealogy, I would say, is like the credits after you've watched a movie. You know, all the names of the characters, all right, who produced it and all of that. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. So the book of Judges, the book of Ruth took place during the time of Judges. And during the time of Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. No king, no authority figure. So you just do whatever you want to do and it's fine. It's the Wild West. What was God doing during that time when Israel was unfaithful to God? They weren't true to God. They didn't care about fearing the Lord and walking in the ways of the Lord. What did God do during that time period of darkness and depravity when Israel was going the wrong way? God was still working. Here's this broken family. Here's this family that's lost and about to go into extinction, that their name will be no longer in Israel. God is going to restore that family, and God, through that broken family, is going to bring about Israel's king that they need. King David, who is a type of Jesus Christ. So this is quite a story. There's unforgettable people that we met throughout this story. What about those that you already forgot about in the story? The characters that you already forgot about. You see, what we learn in the book of Ruth is God often uses people who are so unlikely for God to use to accomplish his purposes. And some of those people that we already forgot about in the book of Ruth, what happened to them? Well, the first one was Orpah. We saw her in chapter 1. She was the one with Ruth who were clinging to Naomi on the way back to Bethlehem. And Naomi was trying to say, no, you need to go back to your people, find a husband there, be with your people, your gods, all that. And she did, didn't she? We don't know what happened to her life after she went back to Moab. She started on the road with Naomi for that new life, but to her, she didn't think it was worth the sacrifice. How am I going to be rewarded for making the sacrifice of hanging out with my mother-in-law, and hopefully somebody will have eyes on me and I'll be attracted and we'll have a marriage and I can have a family? That doesn't look very feasible. So she didn't think it was worth it. So she turned back. She left her mother-in-law. She deserted her and went back to Moab. And I wonder how many believers or so-called believers start out with the Lord. They start out with the Lord. They start out with the Lord's people. But they realize, you know what? It's really hard to stay on the right path. It's really hard to be with the people that I should be with, the Lord's people. Identify with them and fellowship with them. It's really hard to stay on this path with God's people. There's so many struggles, the trials, the temptations, the discouragements. It doesn't seem like I'm getting much reward from the sacrifice that I'm making. And how many believers start out with the Lord? They look so good. Oh, this is so promising. Yes. But they don't stay on the path. They don't stay with God's people. What kind of reward are they going to see? Will there be any reward for them? And then in chapter 4, what happened to the unnamed Redeemer, Mr. So-and-so? His name is not mentioned, obviously, because what he did, having no compassion for two widows, for Naomi and Ruth, not making the sacrifice to take care of them, was a shame, was a contempt upon him and on his family from there on. Here was a man who did not have enough concern to say, you know what, I will make the sacrifices necessary because we want to raise up this name of the deceased. We want his name to continue. I will make the necessary sacrifice to make that happen. He wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't willing to trust God that God would meet his needs if he made that sacrifice. He wasn't willing to believe, to imagine that God has something greater for me and taking on this added responsibility. He wasn't willing to do that. And so his name is not even mentioned in the story. We don't know who he was. We just call him Mr. So-and-so. We don't know what happened to his life after that. Was there any reward for him? There was no reward for him. And I wonder how many so-called believers are like that with the Lord. They're unwilling to take on any new responsibility when there's a need to serve others, a need to help others. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to ruin my schedule and upset my plans. I mean, I have got everything planned out, optimum performance. I can't have any of that messed up. Who's in control? God is supposed to be in control of our lives. And God brings opportunities to us. Do we look at those opportunities as accidents? Well, that's going to mess up my day. That's going to mess up my life. I can't do that. That's not what I am controlling. You know, God's in control. And God allows those things to come into our lives for a reason. When we have needs of people that we can serve, even though there's a sacrifice of our time and maybe of our resources, and God has brought that need to us for a reason. There was no accident that this man had the opportunity to help this family. But he said no. No. You know, if we're not willing to follow God's lead and make the changes that we need to when the opportunities presents itself to us, we're going to miss out on what could have been in our lives, of God using our lives in even greater ways. What was the reward for Mr. So-and-so? What's going to be the reward of the believer who's never sacrificing and serving others to meet needs? Well, even though this story has Ruth's name on it, the book of Ruth, to me, it's really Naomi's story, isn't it? How she went through bitterness and loss, how her dreams were broken and shattered, and how God restored that bitterness to fullness, how God put all the pieces of her broken dreams back together again, how God took her and filled her up again. Who did that for her? You say, God did that for her. But God used Ruth to do that for her. Don't you think there is a need for a lot of Ruths in our world today? There are people out there like Naomi who need a Ruth in their life. They are in that bad place, they're in that dark space, and they need to get to a better place, and they're not doing it on their own. They need somebody like a Ruth to be involved in their life. You know, for that to happen, what I see with Ruth is she is a person who is just like that Christian who's learned what Jesus said, that if you're going to follow me, you have to die to yourself. You've got to die to self. If you're going to follow me, you can't do what you want. Those fleshly, sinful desires, you can't do those things. You can't live for yourself. If you're going to live for me and let me use your life, you're going to have to die to yourself. That's what Jesus did. He died to himself for us. And I see Ruth doing that. She denied herself, and she became that person that God used in an amazing way. That Moabite woman nobody knew of. Now we're telling her story. All that sacrifice and hardship Ruth went through with Naomi was worth it. Look at the reward that she got from serving the way she did. I don't know what the age gap was. I said maybe 20 years, maybe more, between her and Boaz. It was like he was old enough to be her father. Yeah, I don't know too many, 18-year-old girls who are wanting to marry somebody 20 years. Sometimes that happens. They're senior. But she was married to an older man. What was that like? What was their marriage like? Well, what kind of person was Boaz? But Boaz was a man who obviously thought of God and focused on God the way he talked to people throughout the story. Boaz, a man who was very kind to people. He was a man who was very generous to making sure they had more than enough food during the harvest. Boaz was a man who noticed the good qualities of people, and he complimented them about those good qualities. He was a man who knew how to encourage. Boaz was a good man. He was a godly man. I think they had a good marriage. I think he was a good person to be with. God blessed Ruth. Well, this really is a story about redemption, of saving a family who are about to lose their land inheritance, of losing their family name that would be cut off in Israel. They no longer existed. They no longer mattered. And one man made all the difference. His name, Boaz, means in him is strength. He had the strength of character to do the right thing. Did he do it out of love? I don't know. It doesn't say that he did, but he did it because it was the right thing to do. He was the Redeemer. He had the financial means to do it. He was related to the family, so he had the opportunity to do it, and he had the heart that wanted to do it. And God rewarded him for what he did. Because in the genealogy of God's Son, Jesus Christ, you will find Boaz in that genealogy. What a reward he had. So in conclusion, in this story of Boaz as the type of Jesus Christ, and we took that as our theme, the romance of redemption. Why did Jesus come? Why did he want to redeem us? Was there a romance in that? There was. Jesus came because of his love for us. He wanted to redeem us out of sin. He wanted us to be his bride. And Jesus, like Boaz, paid the price to redeem. That price was his shed blood. Have you received Jesus Christ as your Redeemer? Can you say that I'm saved? I know that beyond a shadow of doubt. I know that my Redeemer has paid the price and I've received him to be mine. If you haven't yet received Christ, why not do that today? Well, let's pray. Father, we thank you for this story. We know that you honored Ruth. She is the only Gentile woman who has a book of the Bible named after her. Lord, you put her in the genealogy of your Son. Lord, she shows us about the Christian life of denying ourselves and living for others for the good of others. So Lord, help us. We often struggle with selfishness and with a myopic view of life. We don't like to deny ourselves. We like others to serve us, but we don't like to serve others when it messes up our plans and our schedule. We have resources, but we like to make sure our future is going to be okay, so we don't want that messed up either. Lord, we thank you for these people in this story, for the example, for the model that they give us. So Lord, help us to be more like them. We pray this in your name. Amen.